For most of the modern university's history, credentials have been remarkably stable. Students complete courses, courses accumulate into degrees, degrees signal expertise. But over the past decade, something interesting has started to happen. New forms of credentials have begun to appear: microcredentials, certificates, digital badges, short programs designed to teach specific skills. And increasingly, learners are assembling portfolios of learning experiences rather than following a single degree pathway, which raises an interesting question. Is the traditional degree structure evolving, or are we simply adding more layers to the same system? Welcome back to the EdTech Curio Cabinet. Hello again, I'm Christina, the Curio Steward. And today's Curio explores something that sits at the intersection of education, economics, and technology: credentials. Because while teaching methods evolve and learning technologies change rapidly, credentials remain one of the most powerful structures in higher education. They signal expertise, they open doors to employment, and shape how learners organize their educational journeys. But today, the system is beginning to shift. Microcredentials are short learning programs designed to certify specific skills. They might represent mastery of a programming language, a data analysis technique, a professional competency, or a specialized area of knowledge. But unlike traditional degrees, which often require years of study, microcredentials can sometimes be earned in weeks or months. Digital technologies make them easy to issue, verify, and share, which has made them increasingly attractive to both learners and employers. But the idea of alternative credentials is not entirely new. Throughout history, educational institutions have experimented with different ways of recognizing learning: apprenticeships, professional certifications, continuing education programs, industry credentials. Each of these systems emerged to meet a specific need, and many of them coexisted alongside traditional degrees. The modern wave of microcredentials may represent another chapter in this long story. This is where something we explored in season 1 becomes particularly relevant. One of the curios we examined was why STEM assessment still looks the same as it does in 1950s. Despite decades of technological innovation, many assessments still resemble the same formats used generations ago. They have problem sets, exams, structured assignments, and at first glance, that persistence can seem very surprising. But the reason is actually quite simple. Assessment plays a special role in education. It's not just about measuring learning, it's about creating trust. Students trust that their work will be evaluated fairly. Employers trust that credentials represent real capability. Institutions trust that standards are maintained, which means assessment systems change slowly, sometimes much more slowly than teaching technologies. And that helps explain why credential systems also evolve cautiously, because credentials ultimately depend on the credibility of the assessments that are behind them, which brings us to the paradox. Microcredentials promise flexibility. They allow learners to build skills incrementally. They respond quickly to changing industry needs. They create opportunities for reskilling without requiring full degree programs. And governments around the world have begun to support this shift. Here in Canada, we have initiatives with microcredential strategies and funding programs that encourage colleges and universities to develop short, workforce-aligned credentials. Similarly, in the European Union, they've introduced formal framework for microcredentials, including shared definitions and quality standards across their member states. And our neighbors in the US, policy conversations supported by organizations like the Department of Education increasingly focus on short-term credentials and alternative pathways into employment. All of this points to the same direction: more credentials, more pathways, more flexibility, but it also creates a new challenge. If the number of credentials expands dramatically, how do employers interpret them? Which credentials represent deep expertise versus short-term exposure? Which are assessed rigorously? And which are simply participation-based? In other words, increasing the number of credentials can make the entire system far more complex, more complicated even to apply it in practice, not less. And that's the paradox. The very flexibility that makes microcredentials powerful can also make them harder to interpret and put in practice. Despite these challenges, the rise of microcredentials may signal an important shift. Education may become more modular. Rather than following a single linear pathway, school, degree, career, learners may begin to assemble their education over time, combining short courses, professional experiences, traditional degrees, certifications from industry, any type of ongoing upskilling. This idea is increasingly reflected in policy. The European Union's microcredential framework explicitly supports stackability, the ability to combine smaller credentials into larger recognized qualifications. Here in Canada, federal and provincial initiatives have emphasized lifelong learning ecosystems, where individuals can re enter education at different stages of their careers. And then further, organizations like the World Economic Forum have highlighted the growing importance of continuous reskilling in response to technological change. Technology makes this possible. Digital platforms can track learning across institutions, credentialing systems can verify achievements, and learning records can accumulate over time. But modularity introduces a new requirement, this concept of coherence. Learners need to understand how different credentials connect. Employers need to understand how to interpret them. And the institutions play a critical role in that process, not just delivering the content, but helping to structure pathways, ensuring quality, providing recognizable signals. And in this sense, the future of education may not be less institutional, but differently institutional, less about a single fixed journey, but about guiding learners through this evolving pathway over time. Credentials are not just pieces of paper, they are signals of trust, and they represent a shared understanding between educators, employers, and society about what someone knows and what they can do. As education evolves, the systems that communicate that trust may evolve as well, but the underlying goal remains the same: helping learners demonstrate meaningful expertise. Education technology evolves quickly, but the patterns of learning change slowly. That's why we keep the cabinet open. Thanks for exploring the EdTech Curio Cabinet.